Hi, my name is Diane Schuster, and you're watching one of a series of videos that demonstrate the capabilities of COZYROC SSIS Plus, which is a software suite of tasks and components for SQL Server integration services. These demonstrations were built using SQL Server Integration Services 2005. The COZYROC tasks and components are available for SQL Server Integration Services 2005, 2008, 2008 R2, 2012, and 2014 in both 32-bit and 64-bit editions. For more information, please visit www.cozyroc.com. In this video, we're going to talk about the QuickBooks Source component, which you can use to integrate or migrate data from the QuickBooks Online Edition as well as the Desktop Edition. In this demo, I'll be using a QuickBooks Desktop Edition. This component comes in a package of tasks and components called SSIS Plus that complements the standard SSIS. In COZYROC's SSIS Plus product, we provide source and destination components for QuickBooks, which support both 32-bit and 64-bit modes. In this demonstration, I'll show you how to get all the data from composite objects such as invoice line items. The invoice is the main object, and there could be any number of line items associated with an invoice. COZYROC's QuickBooks Source component creates a record for each of the line items on the invoice, and then creates a blank record to indicate completion of all the items associated with that invoice before creating records for the next invoice. I will also show you how to populate a query dynamically at runtime so that you can pull invoices that have been created or modified since a certain date. For this, I'll be using an expression and query XML. Now I'm going to show you how to populate the query XML parameter dynamically at runtime. I want to pull only the invoices from QuickBooks that were added or modified since a certain date. I need to retrieve that date from a SQL Server table and then use it in my query. Now we'll start with configuring our QuickBooks Source. So we drag it onto the canvas, and we go into Configure It. And of course we select the connection manager for QuickBooks that's already set up. And we go to Component Properties. And now we're going to work with the invoice object. We're not actually going to configure the query XML parameter right now because we'll be populating that dynamically. We're going to have several outputs that we don't need, so we'll get rid of the plain invoice. And this is the one that we want to keep, so we'll just get rid of the rest of them so we don't have a bunch of warnings for columns we're not using. And we click OK, and now we'll connect the two components. Now we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how to populate the query at runtime. Alright, so the first thing we did was we set up our variable, which is called date last run. And then we set up an execute SQL task, and we set up the connection manager, and we set the result set to a single row, and then we configure our SQL statement. And here's what that select statement looks like that we use to retrieve the date. Now we'll go to result set, and as you can see, saved date is the name of the column in our SQL Server table where we remember the date, and date last run is the variable name that I showed you earlier that we set up in our package. Okay, now we'll go back to the control flow canvas, and at the end we use another execute SQL task, and this time we're going to save the date that we're running this project, and we set up the connection manager again, and we configured our SQL statement, as you can see here, to update the date that we saved in the SQL Server table. We'll go back to the data flow. And now we right mouse click on the canvas and go down to Properties. And this is where we're going to set up our dynamic statement. We go down to Expressions. We click on this ellipsis here and it opens up the Property Expression Editor. We're going to go find the Query XML property in here for QuickBooks because that's where we want this dynamic expression to go. And now I'll paste the expression that I already wrote into the expression box here. This is the query XML expression that will pull invoices that have been modified or created since the last time I ran this package. Here you can see that I used the variable we set up and filled in with the date that was saved in our SQL Server table the last time I ran the package. Also, I want to point out that the invoice line items are composite objects. That means there can be any number of line items related to that invoice. This line here is necessary in order to request the QuickBooks Source component to pull all the line items for the invoice. If I didn't need to dynamically populate the date at runtime, I still would have needed to include this line to get all the line items. I'll show you a little bit later where you would enter that line for a static query situation. Also, you only need to include this element for the QuickBooks Desktop edition. You don't need it for the online edition. Now I'll close out of this. So now we can execute. And we have success. So we'll stop debugging. And we'll go look at our execution results. You can see we had 14 rows written. Now we're looking at the Excel spreadsheet that contains our results. The line items from each spreadsheet are grouped together with a blank line in between each one. So Candy ordered 3 items, Luke ordered 2, Corinne ordered 3, and Jackie ordered 2. The main information on the invoice is repeated on each line, like the customer's name, address, and phone number. If we scroll over here, you can see that each line contains different items that were ordered by the customer. Now I want to show you how you would indicate that you want all the line items that are part of a main object if you were just using a static query. If we didn't need to populate the query dynamically, we could just include the element to pull the composite data right here in the query XML parameter. There would be no need to go into the properties as I showed you earlier. This particular query instructs the component to include all the line items from the invoice. If you were working with a different main object, you would need to modify the element to include the composite data from that object instead of from the invoice object. In summary, I showed you how to get all the data from composite objects such as invoice line items. COZYROC's QuickBooks Source component creates a record for each of the line items on the invoice and then creates a blank record to indicate completion of all the items associated with that invoice before creating records for the next invoice. I also showed you how to populate a query dynamically at runtime. This component comes in a package of tasks and components called SSIS Plus that complements the standard SSIS. And that concludes this demo.